Welcome to the Silent Empires, where power moves in silence and every story leaves a shadow behind. No interruptions, no distractions, just pure storytelling for those who understand what quiet power really means. If you're here right now, don't just watch, prove it. Hit that like button and drop a comment. I want to know exactly who's with me. Tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Let's see how far this empire really reaches, and who's still awake right here with me. The man sits at the defense table, his hands folded, his expression impassive. In the hushed air of a federal courtroom in Brooklyn, a jury files in, eyes fixed straight ahead, trying not to meet his gaze. Outside, cameras crowd the sidewalk, reporters speak into microphones, and headlines invoke an old name in a new century. The Basciano crime family, once a pillar of New York's underworld, now on trial in the bright light of post-9/11 America. Prosecutors have called him a ruthless leader, accuse him of ordering killings and orchestrating rackets. Defense attorneys paint a different picture, a neighborhood man demonized by the government. The defendant's nickname, whispered and then shouted in the tabloids, sounds almost absurd in this sterile space: Vinnie Gorgeous. It comes from a beauty salon he once owned in the Bronx, a reminder that the man now facing the harshest penalties the law allows did not begin his life as an underworld boss. To understand how a kid from a working-class borough reached this table, between U.S. Marshals and legal pads, we have to step away from the courtroom, away from the headlines, and back into the crowded streets and shifting loyalties of New York in the mid-20th century, to the world that shaped Vincent Basciano before anyone had ever heard the name, Vinnie Gorgeous. Vincent John Basciano was born on November 14, 1959, in the Bronx, New York, at a moment when the city, and particularly its Italian-American neighborhoods, stood at a crossroads. His was the generation that would grow up in the long shadow cast by older men whose reputations were already legend, while the institutions and economies that had sustained those communities began to fray. Publicly available records say comparatively little about the private details of his childhood. They confirm his birth date, his borough, his Italian-American heritage. Beyond that, what emerges is less a neat biography than a portrait sketched in court documents, newspaper profiles, and the testimony of later years. A boy raised in a blue-collar environment, in a borough where ethnic identity, neighborhood loyalty, and the looming presence of organized crime intertwined in complicated ways. The Bronx into which he was born was not yet the burned-out landscape that would become a national symbol of urban decline in the 1970s. In the early 1960s, many parts of the borough were still vibrant enclaves, with busy commercial strips, close-knit families, and a rhythm of life centered on church, school, and local businesses. Italian-American families had been putting down roots there for decades, moving up from Manhattan's older tenements or arriving directly from southern Italy and Sicily in earlier waves. They brought with them Catholic rituals, regional dialects, and a strong emphasis on family loyalty and hard work. By the time Basciano was born, many of those families were entering their second or third generation in America, caught between the traditions of their parents and the pull of a broader, more assimilated culture. In these neighborhoods, respect was a currency nearly as important as money. Men who held stable jobs, as sanitation workers, mechanics, small shopkeepers, union laborers, had their own kind of standing. But another kind of status hovered at the edges of daily life, the aura surrounding those connected, or rumored to be connected, to the mafia, the Italian-American criminal organization that law enforcement called La Cosa Nostra, was by then firmly entrenched in New York. The 5 major crime families, including the Basciano family with which Basciano would later be associated, controlled or influenced a wide array of rackets: gambling, loan sharking, labor unions, construction contracts, and in some cases, drug trafficking. For many residents, the presence of these figures was both mundane and unsettling, something that everyone knew about but rarely discussed openly. It is important to be clear. Most Italian Americans in these communities had nothing to do with organized crime. They built lives through legitimate work, often at significant personal sacrifice. But the visibility of mob figures, the flashy cars, the tailored suits, the whispered stories of power and fear made an impression, especially on younger generations searching for an identity and a path to success. When later prosecutors described Vincent Basciano as a man obsessed with appearance and image, they were touching on a theme with deep roots in the world where he grew up. In an environment where how you carried yourself mattered, where toughness was admired and weakness could be exploited, a reputation could be as valuable as any paycheck. As a child in the 1960s, Basciano would have come of age during a turbulent period for the very family that would later claim him. The Banana organization had been led for decades by Joseph "Joe Bananas" Banano, whose ambitions and conflicts with other bosses helped trigger a brutal internal struggle in the mid-1960s that became known as the Banana War. Although these power struggles played out largely among older men, often at a distance from the average Bronx family, their consequences rippled through the city. Shifts in leadership brought changes in which crews controlled which neighborhoods, which storefronts served as informal headquarters, and which figures younger locals saw as the dominant personalities on their streets. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, as Basciano moved from childhood into adolescence, the Bronx began to change more dramatically. Economic transformations that had been building for years hit hard. Manufacturing jobs that had offered working-class residents a path to stability began to vanish, moved out of the city or out of the country altogether. White flight and racial tension reshaped blocks and schools. New highways carved through old neighborhoods, displacing families and eroding the sense of rootedness that had once seemed secure. The city's fiscal crisis in the mid-1970s led to cuts in services, leaving many neighborhoods with fewer resources, less support, and more visible signs of neglect. No borough embodied this collapse in the public imagination quite like the Bronx. While not every neighborhood suffered equally, images of burned outbuildings, vacant lots, and rising crime became emblematic of the era. Even where fires did not devastate whole blocks, people felt the ground shifting beneath them. For young men in particular, the path to the kind of steady union or civil service job their fathers might have held seemed less certain. At the same time, illicit economies, drug dealing, stolen goods, underground gambling offered quick, if dangerous, money. Law enforcement reports from the period describe a growing presence of narcotics in many Bronx neighborhoods, along with the violence and exploitation that followed. It was in this environment that Basciano spent his teenage years. The historical record does not offer a detailed account of his schooling or his early legitimate employment, and it would be misleading to invent particular incidents or dialogues. What can be said with confidence is that he came of age in a borough where organized crime had a long foothold, where the lure of street money was widely felt, and where social networks often overlapped. A cousin worked for a connected businessman. A friend's uncle was rumored to be with the family. A local bar doubled as an unofficial clubhouse for men whose names sometimes appeared in the crime pages. In such a world, the boundary between the legitimate and the illicit was not always sharply drawn. Later court testimony and media profiles would portray Basciano as a man with a pronounced sense of personal style and pride in his appearance. Long before he became a headline figure in mob trials, he was associated with a business that might seem far removed from the stereotypical image of a street enforcer, a beauty salon. At some point as a young adult, sources place this in the 1980s, he became the owner of a Bronx hair salon called Vinnie Gorgeous. The shop catered to local women, offering haircuts, color, and styling in a neighborhood setting. In the culture of those streets, the salon itself was not remarkable. Many small, family-run businesses anchored local commercial strips. What was noteworthy was the persona that grew around its owner. The nickname Vinnie Gorgeous, which would follow him into FBI files and federal indictments, came from this salon. Accounts differ on exactly how it began, whether it was initially a joking reference from friends, a tag of admiration, or a mix of both, but it stuck. It spoke not only to his line of work at the time, but to his carefully cultivated look, tanned, well-groomed, sharply dressed. Prosecutors would later use this attention to appearance as a metaphor for what they described as his need to project control and command respect. To neighbors and customers, he might have seemed like another ambitious local businessman, someone who had found a niche and was making the most of it. But in the 1980s New York underworld, small businesses were often more than they appeared. Social clubs, cafes, pizzerias, and barbershops served as informal meeting places where mob associates congregated, discussed deals, and collected payments. A legitimate storefront could provide both income and cover for illicit activity. Law enforcement agents who later tracked Basciano's movements would note how frequently figures tied to the Basciano family used such establishments as points of contact. The extent to which Vinnie Gorgeous itself functioned in this way in its earliest years is not thoroughly documented in public records, but as Basciano's life became increasingly intertwined with organized crime, the line between his public role as a neighborhood businessman and his hidden role in the underworld would blur. It is telling that when federal indictments eventually described his rise through the Basciano ranks, they did not portray a cartoonish figure born into crime from day one. Instead, they sketched the trajectory of a man who, like many of his peers, appeared to move step by step from local associations into more serious involvement. Law enforcement material from the late 1980s and early 1990s would later identify him as an associate of the Basciano family, a label used for individuals who work with a crime family and profit from its activities, but are not yet formally inducted as members. This status often grew out of long-standing neighborhood ties and business relationships forged over years. Those transitions rarely happened in an instant, and they were shaped by the wider transformations underway in New York's criminal landscape. By the time Basciano was a young man, the mafia's golden era was under pressure. The federal government had begun using powerful new tools, especially the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO, to go after entire hierarchies rather than just low-level offenders. High-profile cases in the 1980s, most famously the commission trial that targeted the leadership of several major families, challenged the sense of invulnerability that older mobsters had long enjoyed. Informants and undercover agents, such as Joseph Pistone, better known by his undercover alias, Donnie Brasco, had exposed vulnerabilities in the very Basciano family with which Basciano would come to be associated. This climate affected how a younger generation of aspiring figures navigated their path. The old rules of secrecy and caution remained, but the risks were higher, the surveillance more intense, and the consequences more severe. At the same time, the economic rewards of successful rackets still exerted a powerful pull. In neighborhoods where legitimate opportunities were constrained, the combination of money, status, and fear offered by organized crime remained attractive to some. As a Bronx native with a local business, existing relationships, and a personality that others described as assertive and ambitious, Basciano was well positioned to be drawn into that world. Yet it is essential, especially in recounting the early years of his life, not to turn him into a myth. He was not born as an archetype or a symbol, but as a person shaped by specific historical conditions. The post-war trajectory of New York's outer boroughs, the complicated legacy of Italian-American life in the city, the rise and gradual unmasking of La Cosa Nostra, and the socio-economic upheavals of the 1970s and 1980s. The choices he would make, and the consequences that would follow, unfolded against that backdrop. When decades later, prosecutors stood before juries and described him as a calculating figure at the center of violent conspiracies, they were connecting the adult before them to that longer history. By the time his nickname had become widely known beyond his own neighborhood, the kid from the Bronx beauty salon was already on law enforcement's radar as more than a local businessman. The path from one identity to the other would involve a deepening relationship with the Basciano organization, expanding influence in rackets that reached far beyond a single shopfront, and a series of conflicts that would eventually propel him toward the leadership of a crime family and into direct confrontation with the full force of the federal government. Those later chapters, with their indictments, trials, and appeals, cannot be understood without the quieter, less documented chapters that came before. The family apartment in a working-class borough, the changing streets outside, the unwritten rules of loyalty and respect that governed his early world, and the small business where a neighborhood man first became Vinnie Gorgeous in the eyes of those around him. In the years when his beauty salon was becoming a neighborhood fixture, the world around Vincent Basciano was tightening into the pattern that would define the rest of his life. On Morris Park Avenue in the Bronx, Hello Gorgeous was more than a place for blowouts and perms. It was part of a dense social ecosystem. Cafes where regulars lingered over espresso, bars where sports games played on small televisions, storefronts that doubled as informal gathering points for men who had known each other since childhood. In that environment, the line between customer and acquaintance, between friend and business contact, often blurred. As later FBI surveillance and trial testimony made clear, figures tied to the Basciano crime family moved in and out of this world with ease, and Basciano, with his salon, his personality and his roots in the neighborhood, was increasingly one of them. Official records from the 1980s and early 1990s do not provide a minute-by-minute account of how Basciano advanced from local businessman to fully committed underworld figure. But prosecutors, investigators, and cooperating witnesses would later describe the broad outline of this transformation. In their telling, he began as an associate of the Basciano family, someone not yet formally initiated but already participating in and profiting from the organization's rackets. Associates were useful precisely because they straddled the boundary between the legal and illegal economies. They could own businesses, hold leases, deal openly with banks and service providers, while quietly funneling money, favors, and information to the family. For an ambitious associate, the key tasks were straightforward: demonstrate reliability, generate income, and show that you could keep your mouth shut. Income in this context meant making money for the family through activities that ranged from underground gambling, card games, sports betting, to loan sharking operations that targeted people who could not or would not go through conventional lenders. According to later indictments, the Bronx and surrounding areas provided fertile soil for this kind of business. Working-class residents running small shops or driving taxis, bar owners struggling with rent, and low-level hustlers looking for cash often turned to these off-the-books lenders. The terms were steep, the consequences of falling behind serious, and the profits significant. Court documents and cooperating witness statements would later place Basciano at the center of precisely this kind of business. As an associate aligned with the Basciano, he was, by the government's account, involved in collecting payments, extending high-interest loans, and overseeing bookmakers. The salon gave him a legitimate reason to be on the block day after day, a fixed point around which others could orbit. An investigator looking back on that period might see a pattern repeated many times in New York's underworld. A small, legitimate enterprise serving as the visible face of a much deeper, hidden economic network. While Basciano was learning the rhythms of this life, the Basciano family itself was going through its own process of recovery and redefinition. The damage done by the Donnie Brasco infiltration in the late 1970s and early 1980s had been severe. Exposed secrets, prison sentences, and a loss of standing among the city's other crime families. But by the late 1980s, Federal authorities were again describing the Bananos as a significant force, in large part because of the rise of Joseph Massino. Massino, a Queens-based figure with a reputation for caution and strategic thinking, emerged as the dominant personality within the organization. His approach differed sharply from the flamboyant style of someone like John Gotti in the Gambino family. Where Gotti attracted cameras and headlines, Massino preferred the shadows, instructing those under him to avoid public flash and to treat every meeting as if it might be overheard. It was within this culture of guarded discipline that Basciano rose. According to testimony given years later by former Banano members who became government witnesses, the early 1990s were the period in which he crossed a crucial threshold. He moved from being an associate to a formally inducted member, a made man, of the Banano family. Those who testified about this era did not give a detailed, step-by-step account of his ceremony. Such events are, by design, secret and closely held. But they were clear about the meaning of the transition. Once made, a man was no longer simply a useful ally or contractor. He was part of the inner structure, bound by an oath of loyalty, answerable directly to the hierarchy, and entitled, at least in theory, to certain protections and a share of the organization's profits. Prosecutors would later argue that Basciano took this new status seriously. In their arguments to juries and judges, they described him as a man who embraced the traditional values of the organization: hierarchy, discipline, and an intense focus on respect. The nickname that had started light-heartedly at the salon now took on a harder edge. Vinnie Gorgeous might have sounded almost comedic in print, but in the neighborhoods where he operated it became attached to a man whom others knew they had to take seriously. Cooperating witnesses would later say that he expected those around him to present themselves well, to be punctual, and to follow instructions precisely. The concern with appearance extended beyond clothes to demeanor. He wanted his crew to project control, not chaos. As the 1990s progressed, this combination of ambition, organizational skill, and ability to generate money earned him promotions. Law enforcement surveillance, wiretaps, and informant reports eventually identified Basciano as a captain, or capo, in the Banano family, overseeing his own crew. A capo functioned as a mid-level manager, reporting to the family's boss or underboss while supervising soldiers and associates beneath him. In this role, according to later racketeering indictments, Basciano played a central part in coordinating gambling operations, loan sharking networks, and the collection of tribute from businesses within his sphere of influence. That sphere extended beyond a single block or even a single borough. Government filings describe Bronx-based Banano crews as having interests not only in their immediate neighborhoods, but also in parts of Westchester County and other nearby areas. Bookmakers might operate from apartments or back rooms in one community, while laying off bets or resolving disputes in another. Loan sharking customers could be drawn from a wide radius linked not by geography, but by shared acquaintances and shared desperation. In all of this, the Banano family's structure offered both muscle and mediation. Disputes could be straightened out through sit-downs, and the threat of organized retaliation discouraged defiance. The very qualities that made this system effective also made it a priority target for law enforcement. By the 1990s, federal prosecutors in New York had spent more than a decade hunting the use of RICO statutes, which allowed them to treat each crime family as an ongoing criminal enterprise. Instead of prosecuting individual offenses in isolation, they could present patterns, a series of illegal gambling operations here, a network of extortionate loans there, all threaded together by testimony and surveillance to show a continuing conspiracy. In this framework, someone like Basciano was not just a gambler or a loan shark in the narrow sense. He was, in the government's view, a manager within a larger criminal organization. Public records show that by the time the 1990s were well underway, Basciano already had a history of encounters with law enforcement. Exact dates and charges vary across sources, but it is clear that long before his most high-profile federal trials, he had been arrested and convicted on state-level offenses. These early cases did not topple him. If anything, they served as a warning bell for investigators and a kind of dark credential within the underworld, proof that he had been tested and had not, in the view of his peers, betrayed those around him. For prosecutors, the growing file bearing his name marked him as someone to watch closely as they assembled broader cases against the Bonanno hierarchy. The mid-1990s brought further changes to the landscape in which he operated. High-profile convictions of other mob leaders, most notably John Gotti's federal conviction in 1992, had shown that even the most seemingly untouchable bosses could be brought down by a combination of wiretaps, undercover work, and insider testimony. Within the Bonanno family, these events reinforced Basciano's emphasis on secrecy. Witnesses later recalled that phones were to be used cautiously, if at all, for sensitive matters. Meetings might be held in motion, in cars or on walks, to frustrate attempts at long-term electronic surveillance. In this context, the neighborhood social club or the back room of a business took on new significance as places thought, often incorrectly, to be safer from prying ears. Basciano adapted to and, in some respects, embodied this culture. Prosecutors and former associates alike would later describe how he insisted on a certain professional mindset within his crew. Personal conflicts were to be managed so they did not disrupt business. Money owed to the family took precedence over individual grudges. When problems did arise, debts that could not be paid, disputes among bookmakers, friction with people outside the organization, he was, according to testimony, a central figure in deciding how they would be resolved. These decisions could involve negotiation, pressure, or, as the government would later allege, approval of more serious responses. Even as he deepened his involvement in the Bonanno organization, Basciano maintained the outward trappings of a conventional life. He married, had children, and from the outside could look like many other men in his age group. A small business owner, a family man, a recognizable face in the neighborhood. Later reporting and courtroom statements from family members would paint a picture of someone who, in private moments, could be affectionate and devoted, someone whose children looked up to him, and whose relatives saw a side of his personality very different from the one portrayed by prosecutors. This dual existence, domestic and criminal, ordinary and extraordinary, is a recurring theme in the history of organized crime, and in Basciano's case, it would become especially stark once his legal troubles began to dominate his life. Those troubles did not erupt suddenly. They built over time, case by case, investigation by investigation. Through the 1990s, federal and local authorities worked to penetrate the renewed Bonanno structure that Basciano had built. Wiretaps targeted social clubs and suspected meeting places. Undercover agents cultivated relationships with low-level participants in gambling operations. As new informants came forward, often motivated by their own legal difficulties, names like Basciano's began appearing with increasing frequency in their accounts. The composite portrait that emerged was of a man at the center of a Bronx-based network, trusted by higher-ups and feared, or at least carefully respected by those beneath him. As these investigative threads wove together, the Bonanno family itself faced internal tensions common to any hierarchical criminal group under pressure. Ambitions, rivalries, and generational differences all played their part. Older figures who had come up in the mid-20th century found themselves sharing power with men who had matured in the harsher, more heavily policed environment of the late 20th century. Younger captains and soldiers were more accustomed to constant surveillance, more aware that lengthy prison terms were an ever-present risk. They also operated in an underworld crowded not only with other Italian-American groups, but with a variety of independent drug crews and street organizations, that did not necessarily follow the old unwritten rules. Within this shifting terrain, Basciano's ascent was notable. By the late 1990s, law enforcement agencies were describing him not just as another captain, but as one of the most powerful figures in the Basciano family's day-to-day operations, particularly in the Bronx. His ability to bring in money, maintain order, and project an image of confident authority made him a logical candidate for further promotion. At the same time, those same qualities made him a primary target for prosecutors seeking to dismantle the family's leadership structure. In later years, when cooperating witnesses took the stand, they portrayed this period as the height of his influence below the very top of the organization. They described how instructions and information flowed from the boss and underboss down to captains like Basciano, and how money, tributes from various rackets, flowed upward in return. Meetings in cars, restaurants, and neighborhood businesses created a web of contacts that, in retrospect, looks almost designed to give investigators opportunities to listen in or to turn participants into informants. But from the inside, for those who believed in the family's code and in the protection it supposedly offered, the system still seemed functional, even resilient. That belief would be tested as the new century began. The same careful surveillance and patient, long-term investigations that had toppled earlier generations of mob leaders were now closing in on the Basciano hierarchy. RICO cases that had once targeted rival families would, before long, reach deep into Basciano's organization. For Vincent "Vinnie Gorgeous" Basciano, who had spent his adult life moving steadily upward through those ranks, from associate to soldier to captain and influential Bronx power broker, the next turn of events would bring both a new title and a new level of exposure. The man who had long navigated the shadows of his neighborhood would find himself in the brightest glare of federal scrutiny, as shifting fortunes at the top of the Basciano family placed him squarely in the line of fire. The opening years of the new century found Vincent "Vinnie Gorgeous" Basciano at a point where his life in the Bronx and his role in the Basciano organization were fully intertwined. The man who had once been known mainly as the owner of a local beauty salon now moved in a world where his name carried weight far beyond Morris Park Avenue. To prosecutors and investigators who watched him, he was no longer just a profitable captain. He was one of the central figures in a crime family that had, under Joseph Basciano, quietly rebuilt itself into a powerful, if low-profile, force in New York's underworld. By then, the Basciano family's fortunes had turned sharply upward from the humiliations of the Donnie Brasco era. During the 1990s, Basciano had restored discipline, cut back on unnecessary public displays, and focused on steady income from traditional rackets. Extortion in the construction industry, control of certain gambling operations, and loan sharking to small businesses and gamblers still brought in substantial sums. For a time, this cautious approach seemed to pay off. While other families were being hit with major racketeering convictions, the Bascianos avoided the kind of spectacular trials that splashed front pages. Law enforcement sources would later say that, at the end of the 1990s, the Bascianos were the only one of New York's 5 families whose boss was not behind bars. That relative quiet, however, did not mean the family had escaped scrutiny. Federal agents and prosecutors in Brooklyn and Manhattan had learned from earlier campaigns against rival families. They placed a premium on patient work, cultivating informants, analyzing financial records, and stitching together overlapping cases into broader RICO indictments. In the early 2000s, these efforts intensified. New tools for electronic surveillance, greater coordination between agencies, and an increasing willingness of insiders to cooperate against their former associates meant that the secrecy on which Basciano had relied was no longer as secure as it once seemed. An early sign of the family's vulnerability came in the figure of Frank Cappa, a veteran Basciano member who began cooperating with the government in 2002. Cappa's decision to testify broke a long-standing taboo, He was the first fully initiated Banano member to become a government witness. His cooperation provided prosecutors with detailed insight into the family's finances and structure. Not long afterward, Massino's underboss and brother-in-law, Salvatore Vito, also decided to cooperate. The combined knowledge of these insiders gave law enforcement an unprecedented window into the organization. Armed with this information, federal prosecutors prepared a sweeping case that went to the core of Massino's regime. In January 2003, the government unveiled a major racketeering indictment naming Massino and several top lieutenants. The charges included multiple murders, conspiracy, and a wide range of financial crimes stretching back over 2 decades. When Massino was arrested and taken into custody, the man whose caution had guided the Bananos for years suddenly found himself facing the possibility of the death penalty under federal law, an outcome that had once seemed almost unimaginable for a New York mob boss. Inside the Banano family, Massino's arrest created a power vacuum that had to be filled quickly if the organization was to maintain order and revenue. According to later court testimony and FBI reports, Vincent Basciano was among those who stepped into that breach. Already recognized as a successful Bronx-based captain, with his own crew and a reputation for being able to handle business, he was elevated to a key leadership role. Different witnesses would use different language: acting boss, street boss, acting under boss, but the essence was the same. In the eyes of law enforcement and many within the family, Basciano had become the main figure responsible for running day-to-day operations on the street while Massino awaited trial. As acting leader, he faced a complicated landscape. On one side, he had to reassure soldiers and associates that the family remained stable despite the boss being in jail and a wave of indictments in the air. He needed to keep money flowing from gambling, loan sharking, and other rackets, while signaling that the old code of loyalty still applied. On the other side, he knew, or should have known, that law enforcement attention was now more intense than ever. Every meeting, every phone call, every gathering in a bar or cafe had the potential to be monitored or infiltrated. In this environment, small missteps could have large consequences. Yet the public face of his life still held traces of normality. The salon that had given him his nickname continued operating. He remained a presence in the neighborhood, known not only to those involved in criminal activity but also to customers, neighbors, and relatives who saw him in everyday settings. That dual existence, visible and invisible, ordinary and clandestine, was now playing out on a larger scale. Where earlier he had balanced a beauty salon and a crew, he was now balancing the image of a neighborhood businessman with the responsibilities of an acting boss in a beleaguered crime family. The government's later portrayal of this period emphasized not only his organizational role, but also specific incidents that, in their view, demonstrated his willingness to use severe measures to address perceived threats. One of the most significant episodes, which would become central in later prosecutions, involved a Bronx man named Frank Santoro. According to prosecutors and cooperating witnesses, Santoro, a local figure who was not a made member of the Bananos, had spoken about a plan to kidnap one of Basciano's sons as leverage in a dispute. The very idea of targeting a child violated deeply held taboos even within organized crime circles. In the culture of the mafia, families of members were supposed to be off limits. Crossing that line invited particularly harsh responses. Years later, in federal court, cooperating witness Dominic Sickel, one of Basciano's closest associates who eventually turned against him, testified that Basciano had reacted to the alleged threat by deciding that Santoro had to be eliminated. The government charged that in 2001, acting on that decision, members of the Banano organization killed Santoro in the Bronx. They presented this episode not in graphic detail, but as an example of how Basciano, in their view, handled perceived dangers, decisively and without hesitation, even when the person targeted was not an established rival, but a neighborhood acquaintance who had, allegedly, voiced a reckless plan. For years, the full story behind Santoro's death remained largely hidden from public view. It was one of several unsolved acts of violence in the Bronx that law enforcement suspected were linked to organized crime, but could not immediately prove. Only later, when former insiders chose to cooperate and provide detailed accounts, would prosecutors claim to piece together Basciano's role. For the moment, to those watching from the outside, the main visible story was that of a Bronx figure rising swiftly inside a shaken, but still functioning, crime family. As the government's case against Basciano moved forward in 2003 and 2004, the anxiety level within the Bananos increased. Prosecutors had already shown a willingness to seek the death penalty in major RICO murder cases, and Basciano faced precisely that risk. Within the mafia's traditional code, a boss was expected to endure prison rather than cooperate, but the stakes for Basciano were now higher than for his predecessors, who had generally faced only long prison terms. In this charged atmosphere, those around him, captains such as Basciano included, had to consider the possibility that the old certainties might no longer hold. At the same time, law enforcement attention continued to close in on the acting leadership. By early 2004, federal prosecutors in Brooklyn had obtained an indictment charging Basciano with racketeering and related offenses. The charges painted a broad picture of his alleged activities, supervising illegal gambling and loan sharking operations, extorting money from businesses, and participating in conspiracies involving planned acts of violence. The indictment explicitly identified him, for the first time in a formal document, as the acting boss of the Basciano crime family. Armed with this indictment, the FBI and U.S. Marshals prepared to bring him into custody. On a November day in 2004, agents moved in as he left a familiar Bronx setting. News accounts would later describe how he was taken into custody near the salon that had given him his nickname, underscoring the connection between his public persona and his alleged underworld status. Images of him being escorted by agents, dressed not in a suit but in casual clothes, appeared in newspapers and on television, feeding a wave of coverage that delighted in contrasting the nickname Vinnie Gorgeous with the stark surroundings of federal courtrooms and holding cells. At his initial appearances in the Eastern District of New York, Basciano pleaded not guilty. Through his attorneys, he denied being the acting boss of the Bananos and rejected the government's portrayal of him as a central figure in a violent criminal enterprise. They argued that he was being targeted largely because of his reputation and associations, not because of hard proof that he had committed the acts alleged. Federal prosecutors, in turn, asked that he be held without bail, citing not only the seriousness of the charges, but also their belief that he posed a danger to the community and a risk of continued criminal activity if released. While these legal arguments played out in public, an even more consequential drama was unfolding largely out of sight. Facing the real possibility of a death sentence, Joseph Basciano made a decision that stunned both law enforcement veterans and those still loyal to him inside the family. He agreed to cooperate with the government. In June 2004, he quietly began providing information to prosecutors, and later that year, he entered a guilty plea to racketeering charges that included multiple killings. In exchange, the government agreed not to seek the death penalty, and Basciano agreed to testify in future cases and to help bring down his own former associates. One of those associates was Basciano. The most remarkable demonstration of Basciano's new role came when, at the direction of federal agents, he wore an electronic recording device to capture his conversations with his one-time protege. In late 2004 and into 2005, both men were incarcerated at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, awaiting their respective legal fates. Under tightly controlled conditions, they were allowed to meet and talk. To Basciano, These meetings may have seemed like opportunities to coordinate legal strategies and reassure one another. To prosecutors, they were a rare chance to capture on tape the unguarded words of a man they alleged was now the acting boss of the Bananos. The resulting recordings, later played at trial, would become some of the most important evidence against Basciano. In one conversation, the two men discussed the killing of Randolph "Randy" Pizzolo, a Banano associate whose fate would later loom large in the government's case. Pizzolo, by most accounts, was an aspiring mobster whose behavior had angered more established figures. He had reportedly failed in an assignment and made disrespectful remarks about his superiors. According to prosecutors, Basciano saw him as a liability, and before his own November 2004 arrest, gave the order that Pizzolo be killed. Pizzolo was indeed killed later that month in an industrial area in Brooklyn. On the jailhouse tape, Basciano asked about Pizzolo's death, and Basciano, speaking with the confidence of someone expecting his words to remain private, spoke in a way that prosecutors interpreted as taking responsibility for authorizing the killing. Defense lawyers would later argue about the exact meaning and context of his statements. But there was no question that the recording placed him in the heart of discussions about life and death decisions within the Banano organization. The tape also captured him speaking in harsh terms about enemies and about people he suspected of cooperating with the government, reinforcing the government's portrayal of him as both powerful and unyielding. Perhaps even more striking was another portion of the jailhouse conversation in which Basciano, according to the transcript, raised the idea of targeting a federal prosecutor involved in the Banano cases. He did not outline a concrete plan. There was no evidence of steps being taken to carry out such an attack. But the mere fact that he floated the idea of harming a government attorney was enough for prosecutors to later use this passage as evidence of his dangerousness and disregard for lawful authority. In the controlled environment of a courtroom, where each word was read aloud to a silent jury, the exchange took on a gravity that went beyond the casual tone it may have had when first spoken. These recordings transformed the nature of the government's case. What might once have been built largely on the testimony of cooperating witnesses, people whose credibility could be attacked as self-serving, was now anchored in the defendant's own recorded statements. They also provided a vivid window into the relationship between Basciano and Basciano. The older boss, now secretly aligned with the government, and the younger acting leader, still speaking as if the old code of silence held, unaware that the man across from him was no longer what he seemed. Outside the courthouse and detention center, the communities that had known Basciano in a different light watched these developments with a mixture of shock, curiosity, and in some cases disbelief. Family members and supporters would later insist that the man they knew was capable of warmth, generosity, and genuine affection, particularly toward his children. To them, the portrait painted by prosecutors of a calculating leader willing to have people killed over perceived slights or threats seemed one-sided at best. This tension between public image and private memory, between the government's narrative and the accounts of those close to him, would become a recurring theme as his trials approached. For law enforcement, however, the path was clear. With Basciano's cooperation, the array of earlier informants, and the powerful jailhouse recordings in hand, prosecutors prepared for a series of major trials that would not only test the government's case against Vinnie Gorgeous Basciano, but also serve as a referendum of sorts on the Banano family's claim to continued existence as a coherent, functioning criminal enterprise. The man once seen as an ambitious Bronx captain, then as an acting boss navigating a storm, now faced the full weight of the federal government's effort to dismantle the organization that had shaped his adult life. On a gray spring morning in Brooklyn, the courtroom filled slowly, almost ceremonially. Lawyers arranged stacks of binders at their tables, Jurors took their seats with the cautious expressions of people who knew they were about to step into a world they had only seen in films and headlines. And the man at the center of it all sat quietly, his face composed. Vincent "Vinnie Gorgeous" Basciano wore a neatly pressed suit, his hair closely cropped, his posture upright. Small gestures adjusting his tie, leaning toward his attorney to murmur a few words, reminded observers that beneath the avalanche of labels piled on him by the government, he was still, at some basic level, a person. But on that day in 2006 in the Eastern District of New York, the United States called him something else: the acting boss of the Basciano crime family, and the organizer of a criminal enterprise built on extortion, illegal gambling, predatory lending, and killing. The indictment that brought him to that courtroom was the product of years of investigation and months of grand jury work. It charged him under the RICO statute, a legal tool designed not just to punish individual crimes, but to dismantle whole organizations. Prosecutors alleged that from the early 1990s through the early 2000s, Basciano had risen within the Basciano hierarchy and used his position to direct a constellation of rackets in the Bronx and beyond. The case stretched across time and space: bookmaking operations that took bets on sports events, loans whose interest rates far exceeded anything a bank would offer, payoffs extracted from businesses that needed help with permits or protection. At the heart of the indictment was a killing: the 2001 murder of Bronx resident Frank Santoro, which the government said Basciano had ordered after hearing that Santoro had talked loosely about kidnapping his child. From the very first moments of the trial, federal prosecutors made clear how they wanted jurors to see the story. In their opening statement, they described a structured, rule-bound criminal organization in which Basciano occupied a leadership position. They spoke in restrained, deliberate tones, conscious that their language would be recorded and replayed, avoiding sensational imagery while still conveying the seriousness of the acts they alleged. They pointed to the hierarchy: the boss, the underboss, the captains, the soldiers, and located Basciano near the top, first as a captain, then as the man who ran the family's street operations when Joseph Massino was jailed. The defense, in its own opening, took a very different view. Basciano's attorneys did not deny that he knew people in the Basciano family. That much was impossible to dispute. They did not pretend that his name had never appeared in FBI reports or that he had never been arrested in his life. Instead, they attacked the foundation of the government's case: the credibility of its witnesses, the motives of its informants, and the interpretation of its evidence. The government's key witnesses, they argued, were men who had themselves committed serious crimes and were now telling stories designed to save their own lives and shorten their own sentences. These witnesses, the defense insisted, could not be trusted without powerful corroboration. The prosecution's first witnesses set the tone for what would follow. Former Basciano members who had already pleaded guilty to serious charges took the stand, raised their right hands, and swore to tell the truth. Among them were men like Salvatore Vidal and Frank Cappa, whose decisions to cooperate had already shaken the criminal underworld. They spoke in plain, unadorned language, tracing the outlines of the Basciano family's rebirth under Massino, and describing how captains like Basciano fit into that picture. They told the jury about meetings in restaurants and back rooms, about cash envelopes carried up the chain, and about the unspoken understanding that disputes, debts, and discipline were handled within the organization's own framework, not by calling the police. When the questioning turned to the killing of Frank Santoro, the tone in the room shifted slightly. Prosecutors did not linger on physical detail. They did not need to. Their task was to show why, in their view, the killing had been ordered and who was responsible for ordering it. According to the testimony, Santoro had angered and alarmed Basciano by talking about an outrageous plan, abducting Basciano's son as leverage in a dispute. In the close-knit culture of the mafia, where families were supposed to be off limits, such talk was not just offensive. It was seen as a grave threat. Cooperating witnesses told the jury that once Basciano heard about Santoro's remarks, he decided Santoro had to be removed as a danger, and that he conveyed that decision to his subordinates. The defense cross-examined those witnesses aggressively. Defense attorneys stepped carefully through their prior crimes, their plea agreements, the sentences they hoped to avoid. They asked how many times each man had lied in the past, whether to law enforcement, their own families, or each other. They pressed them on inconsistencies between earlier statements and their present testimony, suggesting that details had been shaped over time in response to the government's needs. The implication was clear. If these men were willing to admit to ordering or carrying out killings, what would stop them from also inventing or exaggerating stories about someone else in order to win leniency? Yet the government's case did not rest entirely on former insiders. Another, quieter presence in the courtroom hovered over nearly every day of testimony: the recorded conversations between Basciano and the man who had once been his boss. By the time the trial began, it was publicly known that Basciano had agreed to cooperate with the government. What had not been fully appreciated outside legal circles was the extent of his cooperation. Under the government's direction, he had worn a recording device during several prison meetings with Basciano at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. Those meetings, prosecutors argued, captured the defendant speaking candidly about the inner workings of the Basciano family and about acts of violence that had already taken place. Before jurors ever heard the tapes, the lawyers battled over them in legal motions and sidebars. The defense argued that the recordings were ambiguous, that statements could be misinterpreted when stripped of context, and that jurors might hear guilt in words that simply reflected bravado, frustration, or speculation. The prosecution countered that the defendant's own voice was the most reliable evidence of all, a rare chance to hear how a man at the top of an organized crime family spoke when he believed he was among his own. When the judge allowed the tapes to be introduced, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew taut. Jurors leaned forward as the crackling audio filled the room, accompanied by written transcripts they could follow. On the tapes, the voices of Basciano and Basciano were sometimes muffled, forcing listeners to rely on context and repetition. The two men spoke about loyalty, about people who had disappointed them, about those they suspected of cooperating. They referred obliquely to specific incidents, including the killing of Randolph Pizzolo, which would be the centerpiece of a later trial. In the government's telling, the way Basciano spoke on the tapes showed that he was not a marginal figure but a decision-maker who took responsibility for what happened on the street. For the jurors, the tapes provided something no witness could: a sense of how the defendant sounded when he believed he was speaking privately to the man he still regarded as boss. The prosecution pointed to particular phrases and exchanges, arguing that they amounted to admissions. The defense urged jurors to consider the broader context, that conversations between men immersed in a culture of intimidation and rumor could include exaggeration, coded language, or hypotheticals, and that it was dangerous to interpret every phrase as a literal confession. Alongside these central themes, the trial also addressed one of the most explosive allegations to emerge from the long investigation: the claim that Basciano had plotted to have a federal prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Greg Andres, killed. The government charged that while jailed, Basciano had discussed harming Andres and had written down names of people, including Andres, in a way they interpreted as a list of potential targets. They argued that this showed his willingness to direct violence not only at rivals in the underworld, but also at representatives of the state. On this point, too, the defense pushed back hard. They insisted that there was no concrete plan, no evidence of arrangements being made, no money paid, no weapons acquired. The notes the government described as a hit list, they said, were taken out of context and could not support the dramatic interpretation prosecutors placed on them. Their client, they argued, was a man under extraordinary pressure, venting anger and frustration in words that were never acted upon. Over and over, they reminded the jury that under American law, a person could not be convicted for thoughts or casual venting alone. As witness after witness took the stand, former soldiers, bookmakers, law enforcement agents who had monitored wiretaps and tailed suspects through Bronx streets, the picture presented to the jury grew more intricate. The prosecutors drew lines connecting names, places, and payments. A bookmaker might testify about how much he turned over to Basciano's crew each week. A former soldier might describe delivering messages from the acting boss to lower-level participants in a loan sharking scheme. An FBI agent might explain how investigators linked coded phone calls to specific acts, such as a sit-down to resolve a territorial dispute between bookmakers. The defense, for its part, tried to break those lines wherever they could. They questioned whether an overheard nickname really referred to their client, whether a phrase on a wiretap truly pointed to a planned act of violence or was merely casual talk. They emphasized that many of the business dealings described, conversations about debts, negotiations over payments, could sound more sinister than they were when viewed through the lens of a RICO indictment. Their goal was not to persuade the jury that the Basciano family did not exist, nor that their client had never broken the law. Rather, they sought to convince the jurors that the government had failed to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Basciano occupied the central, directing role alleged, or that he had personally ordered specific killings. Day by day, the trial became a study in contrasts. On one side sat the defendant, dressed with the same care he had shown years earlier on Morris Park Avenue, still projecting control even as marshals escorted him in and out. In the gallery, family members and friends watched, sometimes shaking their heads at particularly harsh characterizations, sometimes wiping away tears when private parts of their lives were discussed in public. On the other side sat prosecutors and agents whose careers had been built on dismantling the very structure they now described. Men and women who had spent years listening to wiretaps and following suspects through the city's streets and highways. When, after weeks of testimony and argument, the case finally went to the jury, the 12 men and women retired behind closed doors with hundreds of pages of transcripts, exhibits, and legal instructions. They had to sift not only through the government's narrative of a coherent criminal enterprise, but also through the defense's attack on the credibility of almost every major witness. They had to decide how much weight to give to recorded conversations that were sometimes murky in sound and phrased in language unfamiliar to most outsiders. They had to separate, as the judge instructed them, evidence from speculation and possibility from proof. The verdict, when it came in May 2006, represented both a victory and a limitation for the prosecution. Jurors found Vincent Basciano guilty on a series of RICO counts, including racketeering, illegal gambling, loan sharking, and the 2001 murder of Frank Santoro in aid of racketeering. In doing so, they accepted the government's contention that he had been a key leader in the Basciano family's criminal activities and had ordered a killing in response to an alleged threat against his child. At the same time, they acquitted him of the charge that he had solicited the murder of Assistant U.S. Attorney Andres. On that explosive allegation, they concluded that the government had not met its burden of proof. When the clerk read the verdicts aloud, Basciano's expression remained controlled. Those in the gallery who had come to support him showed a range of reactions: quiet sobs, tight-jawed resignation, staring straight ahead. For the prosecutors and agents, the convictions marked a significant moment. An acting boss of a New York crime family had been found guilty at trial of running a criminal enterprise and ordering a killing. It was another sign, to those who had spent their careers fighting organized crime, that the era of bosses living out their lives in quiet impunity was over. Sentencing came the following year, in 2007, after the customary round of pre-sentence reports and legal briefing. In a federal courtroom that had now become familiar to him, Basciano stood before the judge to hear his fate. Prosecutors urged a life sentence, emphasizing the gravity of the racketeering enterprise and the deliberate nature of the Santoro killing. They argued that his leadership role within the Basciano family, his ability to direct others to commit crimes, and his unwillingness to abandon that life until the government intervened all justified the harshest available punishment short of death. Defense counsel, acknowledging the seriousness of the convictions, nevertheless asked the court to consider their client's family ties, his age, and the prospect that he would spend decades behind bars even with a lesser sentence. They again raised questions about the reliability of certain witnesses and urged the judge not to give undue weight to uncharged or acquitted conduct. They reminded the court that the jury had rejected the most sensational allegation, the alleged plot against the prosecutor, and suggested that this showed the need for caution in accepting the government's broader portrayal of him. Before the sentence was pronounced, Basciano had a chance to speak. Accounts from those present describe a brief statement rather than a long speech. He did not confess to the crimes of which he had been convicted. To do so would have contradicted the stance he and his defense team had taken throughout the trial. But he did acknowledge, in general terms, that his life and choices had brought him and those around him to that moment. He expressed concern for his family and spoke of the years they would now face without him present. The judge, weighing the statutory factors and the advisory sentencing guidelines, imposed a sentence of life imprisonment plus additional years on the various counts, effectively ensuring that, regardless of future developments, the man once known primarily as the owner of Vinnie Gorgeous would spend the rest of his life in federal custody. In explaining the decision, the court pointed to the organized, sustained nature of the criminal conduct, the leadership role Basciano had played, and the need for deterrence in cases involving entrenched organized crime. In the months that followed, his attorneys filed appeals, challenging aspects of the trial and the admissibility of certain evidence, including portions of the recorded conversations with Basciano. They argued that prejudicial material had been allowed before the jury, and that the cooperation-driven testimony of former insiders should have been treated with greater skepticism. Appellate judges, however, reviewing the trial record, found no reversible error. The convictions and the life sentence were upheld, solidifying the legal outcome of a case that had already altered the balance of power within the Basciano family. Yet even as those appeals were working their way through the system, another legal battle was already taking shape. The government, having secured a life sentence, chose to pursue a second major case against Basciano, this time centered on the 2004 killing of Randolph Pizzolo, and this time with the possibility of the federal death penalty formally on the table. For a man already condemned to spend the remainder of his days in prison, the stakes would, paradoxically, become even higher, as prosecutors sought not just to incarcerate him, but to convince a jury that he should be put to death for his role in the life he had led. Jury duty notices went out across Brooklyn and Queens with the same bland language as always, but behind the form, letters, and courthouse security lines lay an unusually stark question. The citizens summoned in early 2011 were not only being asked to weigh guilt or innocence, they were being asked whether, if it came to it, they could vote to end a man's life. In a federal courtroom in the Eastern District of New York, prosecutors and defense lawyers began the careful, methodical process of selecting a death-qualified jury for the second major trial of Vinnie Gorgeous, Basciano. By then, Basciano was already serving a life sentence for racketeering and the murder of Frank Santoro. The new case centered on a different killing, the 2004 death of Randolph "Randy" Pizzolo, a Basciano associate whose body had been found late one November night in an industrial corner of Brooklyn. The government alleged that Basciano, acting as the street boss of the Basciano family, had ordered the killing to send a message to punish perceived disrespect, to remove a troublesome subordinate, and to assert his authority at a moment when the family's leadership was under intense pressure. Because the charge of murder in aid of racketeering carried the possibility of the federal death penalty, the trial would be unlike almost any other organized crime case in New York. Federal capital prosecutions were rare. Capital prosecutions of a man described as the acting boss of a traditional mafia family were rarer still. The Attorney General of the United States had personally authorized prosecutors to seek death, and with that authorization came a long, formal process. Potential jurors were questioned at length about their views on capital punishment. Could they, in principle, vote for a death sentence? Could they, in principle, vote for life, even if they found the defendant guilty of a death-eligible offense? Only those who said yes to both, those willing to follow the law wherever it led, would be seated. In the courtroom, the man whose fate they were being asked to weigh looked much as he had in the previous trial, well-groomed in a suit, surrounded by legal pads and thick case files. Basciano was now in his early 50s, his hair gray at the temples, his demeanor outwardly calm. To some in the room he was a symbol, a remnant of an older underworld facing judgment in a new century. To his family members who sat on the benches behind the defense table, he was a father, a husband, a brother. For the prosecutors, he was the focal point of almost a decade of work aimed at dismantling the revived Bonanno hierarchy. The story they told the jury began not in 2004, but several years earlier, in the period when Basciano was still a rising captain. Through the testimony of cooperating witnesses and the use of earlier transcripts, they reconstructed the Bonanno family's internal world. The titles, the expectations, the way associate members like Pizzolo positioned themselves in hopes of promotion. Pizzolo, they said, was a brash, ambitious man who longed to be formally inducted. He wanted, in the parlance of that world, to be made. But he also drank heavily, gambled recklessly, and in the view of more senior figures, failed to show the discipline expected of someone seeking advancement. According to the government's theory, by late 2004, after Joseph Massino's arrest and during Massino's pretrial detention, Basciano had effectively become the street boss. In that role, prosecutors said, he faced a delicate balancing act, projecting strength to keep the family's operations intact while avoiding the kinds of high-profile crimes that would invite even more scrutiny. They argued that Pizzolo, instead of respecting that precarious situation, became a problem. He allegedly spoke out of turn, made demands to be inducted, and, in one particularly galling episode described by witnesses, publicly insulted senior Bonanno members in a bar. For a leader determined to maintain order and respect, such behavior from a subordinate was, in the government's view, intolerable. At the center of the prosecution's narrative stood a man who had once been among Basciano's closest allies, Dominic Sicil. A Bronx-born Bonanno member, Sicil had come up under Basciano in the early 2000s, serving as his right-hand man in various rackets. After his own arrest, he chose to cooperate with the government, and by 2011 he had already testified in several trials. Now he took the stand against his former mentor. Under questioning from the prosecution, Sicil spoke quietly but firmly, describing how, he said, the order to kill Pizzolo had been given. He told the jury that Basciano saw Pizzolo as an embarrassment, a man who could not be trusted to represent the family. He recounted meetings in which Pizzolo's behavior was discussed, and moments when, according to his account, Basciano expressed frustration with the younger man's drinking, talking, and demands. Ultimately, Sicil testified, Basciano decided that enough was enough. He claimed that Basciano authorized the killing and tasked others with carrying it out, making clear that the decision came from the top. Sicil's testimony was detailed: dates, locations, names of those present. He spoke about planning discussions and about the atmosphere among those entrusted with carrying out the order. But as with any cooperating witness, his credibility was a central battleground. On cross-examination, defense attorneys went meticulously through his past. They reviewed his own admitted crimes, the the deals he had struck with the government, the sentencing benefits he hoped to receive in return for his cooperation. They suggested that he had every incentive to please prosecutors by placing the heaviest possible blame on Basciano, the highest-ranking figure still available to be prosecuted. The defense also highlighted moments where Sickles' current testimony differed in small ways from earlier statements, arguing that these shifts showed an evolving story rather than a fixed truth. They reminded the jury that he was serving a lengthy sentence even with his cooperation, and that his only realistic hope for eventual release lay in continuing to help the government. Time and again, they asked him variations of the same question. How can we be sure you are telling the truth now, when you admit you lied so often in the past? Sickles was not the only insider to take the stand. Another key witness was James Tartagliani, a Bonanno associate who also cooperated. He testified about the logistics of the Pizzolo killing and about the culture of obedience that characterized the organization. According to Tartagliani, orders from someone in Basciano's position were not treated as suggestions. When the acting boss said that someone had to be removed, lower-ranking members understood what that meant, even if the words used were indirect. Like Sickles, Tartagliani faced intense cross-examination about his motives, prior lies, and hopes for leniency. What set this trial apart from almost any other mafia case, however, was the presence of one witness, Joseph Massino himself. The man who had once ruled the Bonanno family and restored its standing now walked into the courtroom in a prison jumpsuit and took the stand for the government. It was the first time a former boss of one of New York's traditional crime families testified in open court against one of his own former captains. The moment carried symbolic weight beyond the particulars of the case. Massino, soft-spoken and methodical, recounted his decades in the Bonanno organization, his rise to power, and his eventual decision to cooperate after facing the possibility of a death sentence. He described how, after his arrest in 2003, he left day-to-day operations in the hands of trusted subordinates, among whom, he said, was Basciano. He confirmed that by late 2003 and 2004, Basciano was acting as the street boss, taking responsibility for resolving disputes, collecting money, and maintaining discipline. When the questioning turned to the jailhouse meetings recorded by the FBI, Massino walked the jury through portions of the conversations, explaining the coded or elliptical language that two career insiders used. Prosecutors played excerpts of the tapes in which they said Basciano admitted ordering Pizzolo's killing or spoke of it in terms that amounted to taking credit. Massino, now aligned with the government, interpreted those words for the jury, placing them in the context of how leaders typically discussed such matters with each other. On cross-examination, the defense attacked Massino's credibility even more fiercely than that of the other witnesses. They emphasized that he had admitted to involvement in multiple killings over his career, that he had run a criminal enterprise for decades, and that his decision to cooperate had spared him from a potential death sentence. They suggested that he, of all people, had the greatest incentive to please the government by supporting its case against Basciano. They also argued that Massino's interpretations of the taped conversations were, at best, just that, interpretations, and that the jurors should rely on their own reading of the words rather than deferring to a man with every reason to deflect blame. The tapes themselves, heard again in this trial, played a crucial role. On one recording, the men discussed Pizzolo's death. The prosecution highlighted Basciano's apparent pride in having taken care of a problem, painting it as confirmation that he had ordered the killing. The defense countered that the language was vague, that boasting and posturing were common in that milieu, and that the government was selectively emphasizing certain phrases while downplaying others that cast doubt on its narrative. All the while, the underlying facts of Pizzolo's death remained relatively simple and undisputed. Late on the night of November 30, 2004, he was found shot in a desolate area near the Williamsburg waterfront. There was no evidence of a robbery or random confrontation. Investigators quickly suspected a targeted attack linked to organized crime, but it took years, until the cooperation of insiders like Sikil and Tartaglini, for prosecutors to claim they had a clear picture of who had ordered it and why. As in the earlier trial, the defense did not attempt to convince the jury that the Basciano family did not exist, or that Pizzolo's death was unrelated to its internal dynamics. Instead, they challenged the idea that the decision had come from Basciano. They suggested that others within the organization might have had reasons to want Pizzolo gone and could have acted on their own initiative. They underscored that nearly every witness who pointed to Basciano had something to gain by doing so, whether a reduced sentence or protection in custody. Their task was to sow enough doubt about the chain of command that jurors would hesitate to impose the gravest possible legal consequence. After weeks of testimony, painstakingly argued motions, and closing statements that framed the case in starkly different moral terms, the jury retired to deliberate on guilt. In May 2011, they returned with their verdict. Vincent "Vinnie Gorgeous" Basciano was guilty of murder in aid of racketeering for ordering the death of Randolph Pizzolo, as well as of related racketeering offenses. With that, the trial moved into its most solemn phase, the penalty stage, in which the same jurors would decide whether he should be sentenced to life imprisonment or death. In capital cases, this second phase is almost like a new trial, but with a different focus. The prosecution presents aggravating factors, elements they argue make the crime particularly severe, and the defendant particularly deserving of the harshest penalty. The defense presents mitigating factors, circumstances that, while not excusing the crime, should, in their view, lead the jury to spare the defendant's life. Prosecutors in Basciano's case emphasized his leadership role in the Basciano family and the calculated nature of the Pizzolo killing. They argued that he had used his authority to decide who lived and who died, and that he had taken a human life not in a moment of panic or passion, but as a considered act meant to uphold his power. They also pointed to the broader context: his previous racketeering conviction, the earlier murder of Santoro, and what they portrayed as a pattern of ordering violence to address threats and disrespect. For them, the message was clear. Here was a man who, given the chance, had repeatedly chosen coercion and lethal force as tools of control. The defense, facing the possibility that their client could be executed despite already serving life, shifted their focus from contesting specific evidence to presenting a fuller picture of the man behind the charges. They called family members, including his children, to speak about the role he had played in their lives. They described moments at home, small kindnesses, efforts, however compromised by his other activities, to provide for his family. They brought in psychological experts and others who could explain how environment, upbringing, and the culture of certain neighborhoods made pathways into organized crime more likely for some young men than for others. Their goal was not to rewrite his past. The jury had already convicted him. Instead, they asked the jurors to consider whether ending his life would serve any constructive purpose. He was already in his 50s, already facing a life sentence from the earlier case. Another life sentence for the Pizzolo conviction would mean he would die in prison regardless. They argued that mercy in this context did not mean excusing his actions, but recognizing his continuing humanity and the suffering his execution would inflict on relatives who had themselves committed no crimes. In closing arguments on the penalty phase, both sides stepped back from the granular details of FBI reports and wiretap transcripts and spoke more broadly about law, justice, and responsibility. The prosecution urged the jury to consider the message their decision would send to crime families still operating in the shadows, to communities in the Bronx and Brooklyn that had lived for decades under the influence of organized crime. The defense urged them to consider the weight of an irreversible decision, the idea that the law allowed room for even a man like Basciano to be punished with life, rather than death. The jurors deliberated again, now with an even heavier burden. In the end, they found that while several aggravating factors had been proven, they did not unanimously agree that death was the appropriate sentence. They rejected the prosecution's request for capital punishment and instead recommended that Vincent Basciano be sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of release for the murder of Randolph Pizzolo. When the verdict was read, there was no celebration in the courtroom. For the Pizzolo family, the formal conclusion that someone had been held responsible for his death brought a measure of legal closure, but could not alter their loss. For the Basciano family, the decision against death was a relief, but it came in the shadow of the reality that he would now spend the rest of his life, beyond any realistic hope of parole, in federal prison. For the prosecutors and agents, the life sentence represented both a personal and institutional success. The acting boss of a major crime family had been tried twice and condemned to spend his days behind bars. Judge Nicholas Garofis, presiding over the case, formally imposed the sentence, noting the jury's findings and the statutory requirements. In the broader history of mafia prosecutions, the case marked an inflection point. Not only had a former boss, Massino, taken the stand against his own, the government had also tested and found the limits of using the federal death penalty in an organized crime context. The result underscored the gravity of capital punishment in American law. Even in the face of serious crimes and a leadership role in a notorious organization, a jury of citizens in Brooklyn had chosen life over death. With the conclusion of the Pizzolo trial, the legal battles that had defined Basciano's middle years drew to a close. Appeals would follow, as they nearly always do in complex federal cases, but the basic contours of his fate were set. Multiple life sentences, imposed after two major racketeering trials, meant that the man who had once presided over a Bronx crew from the front of a neighborhood salon would now live out his life under the strict routines and regulations of the federal prison system. The story of Vinnie Gorgeous Basciano shifted, from that point on, from courtroom drama and street power struggles to the slower, more austere world of long-term incarceration, and to the broader question of what his rise and fall said about the changing face of organized crime in New York. The decision reached not in a courtroom, but in Washington, D.C., set the stage for what would become one of the most closely watched organized crime trials of the new century. At the Department of Justice, far from Morris Park Avenue or the Brooklyn waterfront, senior officials reviewed thick binders of case summaries, legal memos, and investigative reports bearing the name Vincent John Basciano. He was already serving a federal life sentence for racketeering and the murder of Frank Santoro. Yet prosecutors in Brooklyn, backed by FBI agents who had spent years on the Bonanno beat, urged that the government go further. They wanted authorization to seek the death penalty on a new set of charges, most notably, the 2004 murder of Bonanno associate Randolph "Randy" Pizzolo. Under federal law, that decision could not be made casually or locally. Seeking the death penalty requires formal approval from the Attorney General, the government's top law enforcement official. In lengthy submissions, the U.S. Attorney's Office laid out their case. They argued that Pizzolo's killing was not an isolated act, but one committed in aid of racketeering, meant to solidify Basciano's authority within the Bonanno family and send a message about the price of disloyalty and disrespect. They emphasized that he had already been convicted of ordering another murder, and that the pattern justified the harshest penalty the law allowed. After internal review, the Justice Department agreed. A formal notice of intent to seek the death penalty was filed in federal court in Brooklyn. For a man already condemned to spend the rest of his life behind bars, the government's move transformed his legal situation from grave to existential. It was unusual, even in the long history of prosecutions against New York's crime families, for federal prosecutors to ask a jury to impose death on a mob figure. Earlier bosses and underbosses had been sent away for life, but the death penalty had rarely been seriously pursued in such cases. That it now hung over Vincent "Vinnie Gorgeous" Basciano underscored how far both he and the Basciano organization had fallen, and how determined prosecutors were to turn his case into a broader statement about the consequences of organized crime. The new indictment, building on the earlier case but distinct from it, centered on events that had taken place in the late autumn of 2004, even as federal agents were closing in on Basciano and other Basciano figures. Randolph Pizzolo, the man whose death would anchor the capital charges, was not a long-established mob elder. He was, by most accounts, an associate, an ambitious, sometimes volatile figure on the margins of the Basciano family, eager to prove himself but prone to the kind of missteps that created friction in a system obsessed with hierarchy and discipline. Cooperating witnesses would later tell jurors that Pizzolo had been involved in both legitimate construction work and underworld activity, and that he had failed in a task linked to the family, an incident that embarrassed those above him. More importantly, they said, he had begun speaking out of turn, airing grievances, and making disrespectful remarks about the very people whose approval he needed. In an organization where perceived disrespect could be as dangerous as betrayal, this behavior marked him as a problem. The government's narrative, built from those insider accounts and bolstered by the jailhouse recordings of conversations between Basciano and former boss Joseph Massino, was that the acting leader of the Bascianos concluded Pizzolo had to be killed. The killing itself took place late on the night of November 30, 2004. In an industrial area of Greenpoint, Brooklyn, Pizzolo's body was found lying near a waterfront warehouse. News reports at the time noted that the killing bore the marks of a professional hit and hinted at organized crime involvement, but there were no immediate arrests. Only later, as the government assembled its larger case against the Bascianos and more insiders chose to cooperate, would prosecutors claim to have reconstructed who had ordered the killing, who had carried it out, and why. By the time the new indictment was filed and the death penalty notice served, Basciano was already a familiar figure in the Brooklyn federal courthouse. The same judge who had presided over his earlier trial, Nicholas Garofis, would oversee this one as well. From the start, the case was shaped not only by the evidence but by the special rules that govern capital prosecutions. Jury selection took on a different character. Prospective jurors were questioned extensively about their views on the death penalty, not to determine whether they favored it or opposed it, but whether they could, in principle, consider both life imprisonment and death as possible sentences if they found the defendant guilty of a capital crime. This death qualification process significantly lengthened jury selection. Some candidates were excused because they said they would never vote for death, no matter what the evidence showed. Others were dismissed because they indicated they would automatically choose death if certain crimes were proved. Only those willing to weigh both options were allowed to serve. For weeks, the courtroom saw a procession of ordinary citizens being asked to contemplate, in advance, the heaviest decision the law can place on a layperson. Meanwhile, the lawyers prepared. Prosecutors refined their witness lists, knowing that jurors would be asked first to decide guilt or innocence, and if guilt were found on the capital count, then move to a separate sentencing phase focused on whether death was appropriate. They planned to call not only cooperating witnesses like Dominic Sicil, who had been close to Basciano during his years as a Bronx-based leader, but also Massino, the former boss whose cooperation had already stunned the underworld. The jailhouse recordings of conversations between Massino and Basciano would again play a central role, now with even more at stake. The defense, for its part, fought on multiple fronts. They filed motions challenging the government's decision to seek death, arguing that it was unnecessary and disproportionate for a man already serving life. They raised concerns about pretrial publicity, about the impact on jurors of hearing that the defendant was part of an organized crime family. and about the cumulative effect of testimony from witnesses who had committed serious offenses themselves and were testifying in hopes of securing reduced sentences. When those motions were denied and the structure of the trial set, they turned their focus to the jury, to the careful cross-examination of every insider who took the stand, and to building a counter-narrative that, if it could not fully absolve their client, might at least persuade jurors to spare his life. The guilt phase of the trial began in early 2011. Once again, the courtroom took on a charged but orderly atmosphere. Outside, cameras and reporters documented the proceedings. Inside, the rhythms of federal criminal practice, direct examination, cross-examination, objections, rulings, played out in front of a jury asked to make sense of a world far removed from their own. Prosecutors opened by sketching the structure of the Basciano family, much as they had in the earlier trial, then shifting quickly to focus on the events surrounding Pizzolo's death. They described him as a man whose actions and words had placed him in jeopardy within the organization, failing assignments, acting out at social clubs, and speaking disparagingly about his superiors. They argued that Basciano, as acting boss on the street, saw Pizzolo as both an embarrassment and a potential threat, a man whose unpredictability could draw unwanted attention or inspire others to test the limits of authority. From the government's perspective, the decision to have him killed was a calculated move to reassert control and send a signal. Witnesses filled in the contours of that story. Cooperators who had once served under or alongside Basciano testified that he had spoken of taking care of Pizzolo and had authorized the hit. They described planning meetings, assignments of roles, and the aftermath of the killing. One after another, they named the defendant as the ultimate decision-maker, the man whose approval had been sought and obtained. Then came Massino. The former boss, now a federal witness, testified under heavy guard. His appearance was historic in its own right, a one-time head of one of New York's 5 families, taking the stand against an acting leader of his own organization. He spoke about the Basciano structure, his own career, and his decision to cooperate. When questioning turned to his jailhouse conversations with Basciano, the jury listened once more to the crackling tapes, this time with an even sharper focus. In portions of the recordings, the men spoke about Pizzolo's death. According to the government, Basciano's words on the tape confirmed that he had authorized the killing. The defense urged the jury to be cautious, arguing that the language was indirect, that inferences were being stretched, and that a man boasting in front of the person he still regarded as his boss did not necessarily amount to a clear admission of legal guilt. Cross-examination again centered on the cooperator's motives. Defense attorneys walked Massino and Sickle through their own crimes, the substantial prison time they had avoided or hoped to avoid through cooperation, and the benefits they had received. They suggested that memories might have grown more precise over the years in ways that aligned conveniently with the government's needs. They questioned whether some of the witnesses' descriptions of conversations and decisions were colored by hindsight and by countless retellings in debriefing rooms with prosecutors and FBI agents. Still, as the weeks passed, the prosecution's broad picture held. A disciplined criminal organization, a young associate who became an embarrassment and potential risk, and an acting boss who, in the government's telling, responded not with a warning or exile, but with an order that the man be killed. When the guilt phase concluded, the jury retired to deliberate on multiple counts, including the core allegations: racketeering, murder in aid of racketeering, and related conspiracies. Their decision, announced in May 2011, was unambiguous. They found Vincent Basciano guilty of ordering the murder of Randolph Pizzolo as part of a racketeering enterprise, along with several other charges tied to his leadership role in the Basciano family. With that verdict, the trial moved into its most consequential stage, the sentencing phase, in which the same jury would decide whether he should live or die. Federal law requires that in a capital case, Once a defendant is found guilty of a death-eligible offense, the jury must weigh specific aggravating and mitigating factors. Aggravating factors are aspects of the crime or the defendant's history that, in the government's view, make death an appropriate punishment. Prior serious offenses, leadership in criminal activity, commission of the crime in a particularly threatening way, and so on. Mitigating factors are reasons for mercy. The defendant's family responsibilities, acts of kindness in his life, trauma or hardship in his background, the possibility that he could live out his remaining years without further harm to society if kept in prison. In the weeks that followed the guilty verdict, the courtroom heard a very different kind of evidence. Prosecutors called witnesses to describe the impact of Pizzolo's death on his family and community, the fear and disruption caused by organized crime violence, and the danger posed by a man who, in their narrative, had ordered killings even while under legal scrutiny. They emphasized that Basciano had already been convicted of the Santoro murder, and that Pizzolo's killing came after that, suggesting a pattern undeterred by prior arrests or prosecutions. They argued that a mere life sentence had not stopped him before, and would not fully address the seriousness of his actions now. The defense countered by trying to humanize the man whose life now hung in the balance. Family members took the stand to speak about him not as a boss or a defendant, but as a husband, father, son, and brother. They described his involvement in his children's lives, the pain his long imprisonment had already caused, and the further suffering his death would bring. They presented accounts of acts of generosity and loyalty outside the context of crime, help given to relatives in financial trouble, support during illnesses, small acts of kindness that never made it into FBI reports. Their message to the jury was not that he was innocent. By this stage, the guilty verdicts were a fixed legal reality, but that, for all his faults and crimes, he remained a human being whose life should not be taken by the state. Expert witnesses also appeared. Prison officials and specialists in corrections testified about the conditions under which a high-security inmate like Basciano would live if sentenced to life. They described a world of intense monitoring, restricted movement, and limited contact with others, a regime designed to prevent further criminal planning and violence from behind bars. The defense leaned heavily on this testimony, arguing that a life sentence under such conditions would effectively neutralize any future danger he might pose. The prosecution, however, pointed to allegations that Basciano had continued to discuss violent acts even while incarcerated, using that history to argue that as long as he was alive, he remained a potential threat. As the lawyers made their closing arguments in the penalty phase, the atmosphere in the courtroom thickened. The prosecutors asked the jurors to consider not only the suffering of the victims' families, but the long arc of Basciano's career in the Bonanno family. A life, they said, spent not in a single moment of bad judgment, but in sustained, organized wrongdoing. They spoke of deterrence, of the message that a death sentence would send to others who might be tempted to follow a similar path. The defense, in its final appeal to the jurors, focused on the concept of mercy. They acknowledged the harm done, the lives lost, the pain inflicted. But they argued that the law allowed for accountability without execution, that a sentence of life without possibility of release would both protect society and reflect the value placed on human life, even at its most compromised. They reminded the jurors that they were under no obligation to choose death, even if they found aggravating factors. A single juror's refusal to do so would result in a life sentence. When the jury retired to deliberate on the sentence, the stakes could not have been higher. Behind the closed door of the jury room, 12 people weighed legal instructions against their own consciences, balancing the prosecution's arguments about leadership and repeated violence against the defense's portrayal of a man whose life still meant something to those who loved him, and who could be safely confined for the remainder of his days. Hours stretched into days. Then, in early June 2011, the jury announced that it had reached a decision. The courtroom filled once more. Basciano, flanked by U.S. Marshals, took his seat at the defense table. Family members on both sides, the relatives of Pizzolo and the relatives of the defendant, waited in tense silence. The foreperson stood and, in response to the judge's questions, read the jury's findings. They had unanimously found several aggravating factors proved, including his prior murder conviction and his leadership role in the criminal enterprise. They had also recognized mitigating factors: his family ties, his potential to live out his life under strict confinement, the impact his execution would have on his children. Crucially, they had not unanimously agreed that the aggravating factors outweighed the mitigating ones to such a degree that death was the appropriate penalty. Because federal law requires a unanimous vote for a death sentence, this meant that Vinnie Gorgeous, Basciano, would not be executed. He would instead receive another life sentence, ensuring that he would die in prison but not by order of the executioner. The outcome was both a relief and a defeat for different groups in the room. For the prosecutors and agents who had spent years building the case, the guilty verdicts and the life sentence reaffirmed their success in legally dismantling a major figure in the Banana organization. Yet for some, there was disappointment that the jury had declined to impose the ultimate penalty. For Basciano's family, the moment carried a grim sort of relief. The man they loved would never come home, but he would also not face the death chamber. In the weeks that followed, Judge Garofis formally imposed the sentence, another term of life imprisonment, to run consecutive to the life sentence already being served for the Santoro murder and related racketeering offenses. The written judgment reflected the seriousness the court attached to his role in the Banana family's crimes, citing both the findings of the jury and the judge's own assessment of the evidence and testimony. Appeals again followed. Defense attorneys challenged aspects of the jury selection process, the admission of certain pieces of evidence, and the way the government had framed its arguments about aggravating factors. They revisited the jailhouse recordings with Basciano, arguing that the trial court had given them undue weight and that their ambiguities should have been more carefully considered. They contended that the cumulative impact of multiple cooperating witnesses, each with significant incentives, created a risk of an unfair trial. Appellate courts, reviewing the extensive record, upheld the conviction and sentence. They found that the trial judge had handled the complex, emotionally charged proceedings within the bounds of the law, and that the jury's verdicts were supported by the evidence presented. Petitions to the Supreme Court were filed and denied. Legally, Vincent Basciano's fate was sealed. 2 life sentences in federal custody, no possibility of parole. With the end of the capital case, his public legal battles largely moved from the front pages to the inside sections of newspapers, then faded from regular coverage altogether. But his story did not end. Instead, it shifted to a different, less visible phase. Life inside the most secure facilities of the federal prison system, ongoing if quieter legal skirmishes over conditions of confinement, and the slow receding of his name from current headlines into the longer, more reflective narratives of organized crime history. Once the courtroom lights dimmed and the reporters turned their attention elsewhere, Vinnie Gorgeous, Basciano's world contracted to concrete, steel, and schedule. The man who had once drifted between a Bronx salon, social clubs, and corner cafes now lived according to the rigor of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. The photographs of him in tailored suits and overcoats, walking into the Eastern District Courthouse in Brooklyn, gave way to a much less public reality. A high-security inmate serving multiple life sentences, his influence outside shrinking with each passing year, yet his name still carrying weight in the official paperwork that classified him as a long-term management concern. Federal prison records and contemporary reporting place him within the system's highest security tiers. Men labeled by the government as organized crime leaders, especially those convicted of ordering killings and accused of plotting against officials even in custody, are not placed in ordinary units. They are held in tightly controlled environments, single or double cells with heavy doors, limited time outdoors in secure recreation pens, communication monitored and regulated. Mail is read and logged, visits are non-contact or strictly supervised, phone calls are recorded and restricted to approved numbers. For someone like Basciano, whose capacity to organize, direct, and influence others was central to the government's case, these constraints were not just about punishment, they were about prevention. The rhythms of such confinement are starkly different from the fluid, improvisational days he had known on Morris Park Avenue. Inside, the hierarchy is formal and bureaucratic rather than clandestine and self-policed. Correctional officers, unit managers, counselors, and wardens replace captains and soldiers. Infractions are recorded on disciplinary reports instead of being handled in hushed sit-downs. Movement is controlled by passes and counts rather than nods and gestures at a club door. The informal power one might once have wielded on the street can still echo within a prison population. Organized crime figures often retain a certain aura among fellow inmates, but it is filtered at every step through institutional rules. For law enforcement and prosecutors who had spent years building cases against him, knowledge of his new environment carried its own meaning. They had argued in court that as long as Basciano was free, he posed an ongoing danger, able to order violence, guide rackets, and reinforce the code of silence that shielded the Basciano family. Now, though still regarded as a high-risk prisoner, he was physically removed from the neighborhoods and networks that had sustained his career. The Bronx social landscape that had shaped him continued on without his daily presence, even as his story became part of its lore. In Morris Park and other Bronx enclaves where Hello Gorgeous and its owner had once been familiar fixtures, his trials and sentences were received with a mixture of reaction. Some residents, quoted in local stories at the time, expressed resignation. Another figure from that life, taken off the street, another chapter in a long history of men who had mixed neighborhood familiarity with underworld ties. Others were more openly relieved, particularly those whose businesses had long felt the pressure, subtle or overt, of protection payments, loan shark debts, or the constant knowledge that arguments could escalate in ways that brought trouble to their doorsteps. The Basciano family itself, by the time the second life sentence was handed down in 2011, was a diminished institution. Its one-time boss, Joseph Massino, had turned government witness. Multiple captains and soldiers had been convicted in overlapping cases. The FBI and federal prosecutors had used RICO, wiretaps, and informant testimony to pry open the internal workings of the organization to an extent not seen since the Donnie Brasco era. Younger figures stepped into leadership positions as older ones were imprisoned, but their world was notably changed. Law enforcement scrutiny was unrelenting. Technological surveillance, from phone monitoring to digital tracking, made the kind of long-term secrecy once enjoyed by mid-century bosses almost impossible. Within that changed landscape, Basciano's role shifted from active participant to symbolic figure. He became, in the eyes of many agents and crime reporters, one of the last products of a certain kind of New York mafia culture. A man who embraced the old codes, rose through a traditional family hierarchy, and refused to cooperate even when confronted with life sentences and, briefly, the possibility of a death verdict. Where Massino had broken the ultimate taboo by testifying for the government, Basciano did the opposite. He accepted his convictions and sentences without switching sides, sustaining a prison reputation, among both admirers and critics, as someone who had stood tall in the harsh jargon of that world. That refusal to turn state's evidence did not alter his legal fate. Appeals courts, examining the record of his trials, let the conviction stand. In 2013, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit upheld his 2011 convictions for the Pizzolo murder and related racketeering offenses, rejecting arguments that the jury had been improperly influenced or that key evidence, such as the jailhouse recordings with Basciano, should have been excluded. Subsequent efforts to win review by the Supreme Court were denied. The judicial system's door, once open to him as a defendant and appellant, gradually closed. What remained were more technical avenues, petitions over specific conditions of confinement, occasional challenges to discrete procedural issues. None promised to change the fundamental reality of his life sentence. That reality included the slow loosening of his ties to the day-to-day operations of the Basciano family. In his absence, others emerged as street bosses, acting leaders, and key decision-makers. Law enforcement identified new names in indictments, men who had grown up witnessing not only the myths of old-time mob figures, but also the televised spectacle of Giuliani-era trials, and the knowledge that federal agents were always listening. Their version of the mafia lived in a more fragmented underworld, contending with competing criminal organizations of many ethnicities and structures, the rise of synthetic drugs and cyber-enabled fraud, and a city that had become far more expensive and policed than the one in which earlier generations had built their rackets. If Basciano's original neighborhood gradually adapted to a post-mob era, his own daily life in custody settled into the repetition common to high-security prisoners. Publicly available descriptions of such institutions, drawn from court filings, inspector general reports, and the accounts of former inmates, paint a picture not of cinematic drama, but of routines enforced with an almost mechanical precision. Wake-up calls at the same early hour, cell inspections, meals served on rigid schedules, recreation in confined spaces, limited access to programs, and a constant background of institutional noise. Doors clanging, keys turning, public address announcements. Conversations are brief and often monitored. Reading, writing, and television become primary means of passing time. In that setting, his contact with the outside world flowed mainly through letters and occasional visits. At sentencing, relatives had pleaded for mercy, describing his importance in their lives. In the years since, any connection had to survive the barriers of distance, security protocols, and the emotional strain of interacting through plexiglass or under the gaze of correctional staff. Children who had known him as a father in the Bronx aged into adulthood while he remained in federal khaki, their relationship with him mediated by the rigid structures of the visiting room and the telephone line. Outside the prison walls, his name took on a second life in the world of crime reporting and documentary television. Books about the American Mafia updated their chapters on the Bascianos to include his rise and fall. Some were written by veteran journalists who had followed the five families for decades, dissecting the trials, the internal betrayals, and the broader social context. Others were more sensational, focused on nicknames, courtroom anecdotes, and snapshots of personalities. Television docuseries on organized crime began to mention him alongside the better-known bosses of earlier eras, especially when telling the story of how the Basciano family, written off after the Donnie Brasco scandal, had resurged under Basciano only to be struck again by informants and RICO cases. In these retellings, the image of Vinnie Gorgeous was often distilled to a few memorable elements: the beauty salon name that had become his moniker, his reputation for appreciating fine clothes and personal grooming, the stark contrast between that carefully curated image and the harsh lighting of a federal courtroom. Some accounts lingered on the irony that a nickname born from a hair salon sign would one day echo through FBI affidavits, trial transcripts, and Department of Justice press releases. Others pointed to his case as emblematic of how even an organization trying to operate in a low-profile, disciplined way could be undone by informants, hidden microphones, and the sheer weight of accumulated criminal conduct. What such portrayals could not fully capture were the quieter, more mundane consequences of his choices. The long-term impact on the families of men like Frank Santoro and Randolph Pizzolo, The ripple effects on small businesses that had lived for years under the shadow of loan shark debts or protection schemes, and the subtle shifting of neighborhood culture as organized crime influence waned. When federal prosecutors stood at press conferences in the 2000s and early 2010s to announce convictions against banana leaders, they framed their work as a blow not only against particular individuals, but also against a mode of control that had, for decades, exploited the very communities from which these men emerged. In this sense, his story also belongs to the larger history of New York's post-war transformation. He was born into a Bronx where Italian-American social clubs doubled as unofficial command centers for men whose names inspired a mix of admiration and fear. He came of age in the 1970s and 1980s, amid economic decline, rising crime rates, and a heroin trade that pushed some crime families further into narcotics despite official edicts against it. His ascent through the banana ranks coincided with the RICO era, when federal law enforcement gained the ability to mount multi-year cases that knocked out entire hierarchies at once. His final trials and sentences unfolded in the first decades of the 21st century, at a time when the city's murder rate had plummeted. Its skyline bristled with new towers, and the mafia, though still present, no longer held the same grip on labor unions, construction, and local politics. By the mid-2010s, younger New Yorkers in many neighborhoods knew his name less as a living presence than as something encountered in articles, podcasts, or late-night cable documentaries, part of a past that retained a certain dark fascination, but felt increasingly distant from their own struggles with housing, policing, and economic opportunity. For them, the idea of a man whose word once carried weight in back rooms and bar booths, now spending decades in a locked cell hundreds or thousands of miles away, belonged more to history than to lived experience. Inside the prison system, however, time passes differently. For a prisoner serving life, years blend into each other with a repetitive clarity. Holidays marked on commissary calendars, occasional institutional changes, the arrival and departure of cell block neighbors. High-profile inmates like Basciano sometimes surface in court records not for new crimes, but for petitions related to medical care, disciplinary measures, or adjustments in their security classification. Such filings, while technical, provide brief glimpses into their current circumstances, health issues that come with age, grievances over restrictions, and the ever-present hope, however slim, that some aspect of their confinement might be eased. No document, though, has suggested any movement toward leniency in his underlying sentence. 2 life terms, imposed after careful and heavily scrutinized proceedings, stand as fixed points. Prosecutors who handled his cases have moved on to other assignments or retired. Some agents who once trailed him through the Bronx have left federal service. Judges who presided over his trials have taken on new complex dockets. The institutional memory of his cases now lives as much in archived files and legal databases as in the recollections of those who were present. Yet in the long view of history, the arc of his life continues to invite analysis. For criminologists and historians of organized crime, his career offers a case study in how personal ambition, neighborhood environment, and structural opportunity intersect. He was not born into an aristocracy of crime. He was a second-generation Italian-American from a working-class borough, with a legitimate business that could, on paper, have led to a very different existence. But in a world where the boundaries between the legal and illegal economies were porous, and where certain forms of power and respect were available more quickly through illicit means, he chose a path that entangled him ever more deeply in an organization that defined itself by secrecy, hierarchy, and capacity for coercion. The legal system's response to that choice, lengthy investigations, complex trials, and ultimately permanent removal from free society, was shaped by decades of policy decisions about how best to confront entrenched criminal groups. RICO, long sentences for organized crime offenses, and the use of cooperating witnesses were all controversial at times, raising questions about fairness, proportionality, and the moral weight of relying on insiders who had themselves committed serious crimes. His cases contained all of those elements, becoming illustrative as well as punitive. For those who knew him personally, of course, the meaning of his life is more intimate and less abstract. To children, he was a father who disappeared into the machinery of federal justice. To relatives, he may be both the source of painful memories and someone remembered for private kindnesses. To former associates who also ended up in prison or in witness protection, his name can provoke a range of responses: admiration, resentment, regret. The full measure of what his choices meant for himself, for his family, for his victims, and for the communities in which he moved cannot be captured entirely in legal terms. What is clear, though, is that by the second decade of the 21st century, Vincent "Vinnie" Gorgeous Basciano's story had effectively split in two. In the free world, it moved slowly into the realm of retrospective narrative, folded into books and documentaries that look back on the old New York Mafia from a position of relative safety and distance. In the confined world of high-security incarceration, it continued in real time, days measured out in institutional routines, limited by walls and razor wire rather than by the shifting alliances and dangers of the Bronx streets. The path that had begun in a working-class borough in 1959 and wound through social clubs, salons, and courtrooms now ran irrevocably through the corridors of federal prison, the final setting for a life that had once seemed to command the shadows of an entire neighborhood. In the years after Vincent "Vinnie" Gorgeous Basciano disappeared behind prison walls for good, the story of his life took on a second existence in the hands of others. Prosecutors, journalists, historians, former associates, and ordinary New Yorkers all used his trajectory to make sense of changes much bigger than any one man. In that way, his name became less a living force in the Bronx than a reference point, a case that could be cited in arguments about organized crime, law enforcement, punishment, and what it meant to come of age in a city where, for a long time, the mafia was both omnipresent and half invisible. For law enforcement officials who had spent their careers battling the five families, his case was often framed as proof that the tools developed in the late 20th century had finally matured. RICO statutes had been controversial when first used aggressively in the 1980s. Critics warned of prosecutorial overreach and feared that collapsing many separate acts into a single enterprise case might blur the line between individual guilt and collective association. The investigations into the Basciano family under Basciano and the prosecutions that culminated in Basciano's convictions became textbook examples, taught in training academies and law schools, of how RICO could be applied to dismantle entrenched organizations without the public theatrics that had once accompanied mob trials. In those telling of the story, his role was central but not solitary. He appeared as part of a chain: the young captain who thrived under Basciano's cautious regime, the acting boss who tried to steady the family after Basciano's arrest, the defendant whose recorded conversations with his former leader provided rare insight into how decisions were discussed, justified, and remembered inside a modern mafia family. For agents, these materials were not just evidence, but field notes on a subculture they had long studied from the outside. Training materials would quote snippets from his tapes with Basciano to illustrate concepts like authority on the street and the unwritten rules governing loyalty and discipline. Academics and historians, less concerned with the immediate imperatives of prosecution, approached his life as a case study in how organized crime adapted, and failed to adapt, to a rapidly changing city. In social histories of New York's outer boroughs, his early years appeared alongside discussions of deindustrialization, white flight, and the evolution of Italian-American identity. Scholars pointed out that by the time he came of age, the mythology of the old-world men of honor had long since collided with the realities of drug markets, modern policing, and shifting community values. The Basciano family that inducted him in the early 1990s was, in many ways, already a survivor of past defeats, trying to maintain influence in a landscape where large-scale rackets were harder to conceal and easier to disrupt. In that broader view, his ascent and fall illustrated the narrowing space in which a traditional crime family could operate. The rackets that had once been mainstays, labor racketeering, control of shipping piers, systematic skimming from construction sites and union pension funds, had been hammered by decades of investigations. New forms of criminal opportunity emerged in the digital age, but they tended to favor more decentralized groups or loose networks rather than old-style hierarchies. A figure like Basciano, steeped in the rituals and codes of a 20th-century mafia, was in some sense a man out of time, trying to exert centralized control over a shrinking domain, while law enforcement used 21st-century tools to monitor 19th-century methods. For Italian-American community leaders who had long fought against stereotypes tying their heritage to organized crime, his prominence posed a familiar challenge. On the one hand, his story fit perfectly into the narrative favored by certain media outlets. The well-dressed Bronx mobster, the flamboyant nickname, the spectacle of capital trials and jailhouse betrayals. On the other hand, they knew that the vast majority of people who shared his ethnic background and geographic roots lived completely different lives, working long hours in trades, professions, and small businesses with no connection to the underworld. Community organizations took care, when asked by reporters about his cases, to emphasize that he was an exception, not a norm. They pointed to the thousands of Italian-American judges, teachers, police officers, nurses, and shopkeepers who had nothing to do with La Cosa Nostra, even as they acknowledged that, historically, the mafia had embedded itself in certain neighborhoods. Over time, even the underworld's own view of him began to shift. Among older figures who had survived their own brushes with the law, he became a kind of cautionary exemplar, a man who had reached the top of a family only to spend the balance of his life in prison, in part because he had been unable or unwilling to fully grasp how much the rules had changed. Younger men, some of whom flirted with organized crime identities, but saw their peers making money faster and more anonymously through fraud, cybercrime, or drug markets untethered to the old families, looked at his case and saw less romance than risk. The very spectacle that once made mafia life seem glamorously dangerous, newspaper headlines, courtroom dramas, whispered nicknames, now read to many as a roadmap to permanent incarceration. Popular culture both reinforced and complicated these perceptions. Crime dramas and documentaries, always hungry for vivid characters, seized on his nickname and biography. Cable channels produced hours-long specials tracing the Basciano family's history, culminating in segments on the rise and fall of Vinnie Gorgeous. Some of these programs tried to strike a careful balance, portraying the internal codes and rituals of the mafia without glamorizing its activities, highlighting the damage done to communities and victims. Others, less careful, flirted with sensationalism, lingering on images of expensive suits and stylized recreations of meetings in dimly lit back rooms. In these latter portrayals, the man who ended his days in a concrete cell could sometimes seem almost like a fictional figure, a character designed for plot rather than a person whose real decisions had permanent consequences. Yet even the most dramatized accounts could not entirely escape the reality of where his path led. Every narrative eventually arrived at the same destination: the life sentences, the failed appeals, the denial of parole that does not exist in the federal system. For viewers accustomed to films in which mob figures either die violently or walk away into ambiguous futures, there was something stark about that ending. No climactic shootout, no retirement under a different name in a distant suburb, just the measured certainties of federal time. In that way, his story, if told honestly, could serve as a counterweight to the distorted glamour sometimes attached to organized crime images. Debates about punishment inevitably touched on his case as well. Scholars and activists who opposed the death penalty pointed to the outcome of his capital trial as an example of the system's internal restraint. Even in the face of multiple murder allegations and a lifetime of criminal conduct, a jury of ordinary citizens declined to impose death when offered a genuine alternative of permanent confinement. Supporters of the death penalty, conversely, sometimes argued that if a man in his position, convicted twice, accused of ordering killings while already facing charges, could avoid execution, then perhaps the law's strongest deterrent was being applied too narrowly. Legal commentators examining his appeals focused on other issues: the reliability and risks of cooperating witness testimony, the propriety of allowing extensive evidence of uncharged conduct to establish the existence of an enterprise, the ethical questions raised when a former boss like Basciano became both a witness and a covert recorder. Some defended these tools as necessary, carefully regulated responses to the inherent secrecy of organized crime. Others warned of potential abuse, arguing that the system depended heavily on the integrity of prosecutors and the skepticism of judges in weighing what insiders said under the pressure of possible long sentences. From the vantage point of his own cell, much of this debate would have arrived, if at all, secondhand. Inmates in high-security federal prisons receive news in fragments: a headline glimpsed on a TV in a common room, a clipped article mailed by a relative, a passing reference in a letter from an attorney. By his mid-60s, with his body feeling the accumulation of years lived both on the street and behind bars, it is likely that his daily concerns had shifted from the abstractions of legal theory and public image to the concrete realities of health care, institutional routines, and the limited ways in which he could still participate in the lives of those on the outside. For his children and other close relatives, the passing years brought their own reckoning. The figure who had once been a constant presence in their childhood neighborhoods now existed primarily as a voice on the phone and as a seated silhouette behind thick glass. Holidays, graduations, illnesses, and ordinary family milestones unfolded with a permanent empty chair where he might have sat. Some may have visited regularly, others more rarely or not at all. Different families respond differently to the strain of a relative's long-term incarceration. In each case, the harsh arithmetic of his sentences, life plus life, meant that any reconciliation or closure they sought would have to take place within the confines of the prison system. The communities that had once been the backdrop to his daily movements continued to change. The Bronx, long burdened by the images of arson and decay from the 1970s, experienced waves of reinvestment and new migration. Latin American, Albanian, South Asian, and West African families moved into neighborhoods where Italian social clubs had once been anchors. Old storefronts changed hands or shuttered. Some businesses tied, in the public imagination, to earlier eras of mob influence gave way to new cafes, cell phone shops, nail salons, and restaurants serving cuisines that would have been rare in the borough during his youth. The city's economy and cultural makeup shifted further away from the world of his formative years, leaving his story as part of a past that fewer and fewer local residents had personally known. When journalists occasionally revisited his case, on anniversaries of major indictments, in retrospectives about the decline of the mafia, or in obituaries of prosecutors and judges who had crossed paths with him, they tended to frame his life in terms of turning points. There was the child of the Bronx in the 1960s, absorbing the unspoken lessons of a neighborhood where respect and fear were closely linked. There was the young man who chose to align himself with the Basciano family, stepping from association into formal membership. There was the ambitious captain who, in a moment of organizational crisis, accepted the mantle of acting boss. And there was the defendant who, confronted with the combined weight of informant testimony, recorded conversations and sweeping racketeering charges, refused to cooperate, and in doing so locked in his fate. Within those turning points lay the smaller, more private decisions for which no public record exists. No indictment could catalog the internal calculus that led him, in his 20s or 30s, to embrace a particular code of conduct over other possible paths. No trial transcript could fully explain how he weighed loyalty against self-preservation when the government's case closed in. To the extent that he reflected on these moments in later years, those thoughts remained largely his own, shared only in fragments with confidants or family in letters, or in the tightly restricted setting of prison visits. By the time he had been incarcerated for more than a decade, the Basciano family he had once helped lead existed mostly as an echo of its former self. Law enforcement did not declare victory. Organized crime in various forms persists wherever opportunities and vulnerabilities align. But the old vision of a rigid five-family structure dominating the city no longer matched reality. In this diminished context, his name drifted into the broader category of last big cases from a bygone era, mentioned alongside others who had marked the final chapters of a particular style of American mob life. For the larger public, the enduring interest in such figures has as much to do with questions of identity and belonging as with crime itself. Stories like his invite people to ask why some individuals, raised in environments similar to their peers, choose paths that bring them into collision with the law, while others do not. They prompt debates about the roles played by economic constraints, cultural narratives, personal temperament, and sheer coincidence. They force a recognition that while social conditions can shape and limit options, they do not determine outcomes with mechanical certainty. Choices still matter. His choices, made over decades, left a complex legacy. They contributed to real harm, lives ended, families disrupted, neighborhoods subjected to cycles of fear and exploitation. They also helped spur legal and institutional developments that, in turn, reshaped how the justice system deals with organized crime. His trials, appeals, and sentences became part of the case law, an experience that future lawyers and judges would draw upon. In that sense, his story is both a cautionary tale about personal ambition channeled through destructive institutions, and a chapter in the ongoing evolution of American criminal law. As he moves through the later years of his life in federal custody, little of that wider significance likely touches his day-to-day existence. The routines of incarceration tend to compress one's world, focusing attention on immediate concerns: medical appointments, commissary lists, occasional interactions with chaplains or counselors, the maintenance of fragile relationships through letters and short phone calls. Outside, new generations come of age in New York and beyond, their sense of danger and opportunity shaped less by corner social clubs and more by algorithms, housing markets, and global crises. Yet when historians of the 21st century look back on the arc of organized crime in the United States, Vinnie Gorgeous, Basciano will occupy a defined place. He stands near the end of a line that runs from the bootlegging bosses of Prohibition through the labor racketeers of the mid-century and the high-profile figures of the 1980s. His life encompasses the full cycle, the neighborhood childhood in a world where the mafia was a respected and feared presence, the ascent through its ranks during the RICO era, the brief tenure as acting boss in a family shaken by informants, the dramatic trials that tested the limits of federal power, and the long, quiet denouement behind prison walls. In tracing that cycle, one sees not only the story of a single man but the broader narrative of an institution in decline, pressed by economic change, community resistance, and sustained legal pressure. The choices he made and the consequences that followed belong both to his individual biography and to that larger story of how American cities confront and eventually outgrow certain forms of entrenched criminal power. However one assesses his character, whether with condemnation, curiosity, or a complicated mixture of both, his life offers a clear lesson. The allure of outlaw status and local power, however vivid in the moment, is no match for the slow, unyielding force of history, which tends to leave even the most feared figures not in myth, but in records, footnotes, and the memories of those left to live with what they have done.